A mother. 3 bullets. One horrifying night that would divide a family forever. Frances Newton stood accused of executing her husband and 2 young children in their Houston apartment. The evidence seemed clear. The motive appeared obvious. But then something unprecedented happened. The victim's own parents stepped forward. "Don't execute her," they begged the judge. "We believe she's innocent." In Texas death penalty history, families rarely defend their loved ones' alleged killers. Yet here were grieving grandparents, fighting desperately to save the woman prosecutors called a cold-blooded murderer. Was Frances Newton a calculating killer, or the victim of a tragic mistake? April 7, 1987. Houston, Texas. The night was ordinary until it became unspeakable. In apartment 18 of the Haverstock Hills complex, 23-year-old Adrian Newton sprawled lifeless across his living room couch. 1 bullet to the chest. The television still flickered. His dinner grew cold on the coffee table. Down the hallway, a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. 7-year-old Alton Newton lay in his small bed, a single gunshot wound piercing his chest. The boy who loved baseball cards and Saturday morning cartoons would never see another sunrise. In the adjoining room, 21-month-old Farah, barely old enough to walk, had been shot while she slept. The toddler's stuffed animals surrounded her tiny body like silent witnesses to an unthinkable act. 3 family members. 3 execution-style killings. No signs of struggle. The apartment complex buzzed with police sirens and flashing lights as neighbors peered through curtains, whispering the question that would echo through courtrooms for years: who could murder an entire family in cold blood? The answer, according to Houston police, was sitting in their interview room. Frances Elaine Newton, 23, wife and mother to the 3 victims. She had called 911 at 11:56 p.m., her voice trembling through the dispatcher's radio. She had wept over the bodies. She had comforted grieving relatives at the funeral. But within hours, detectives would point their fingers directly at her. The woman who bore these children. The woman who had promised to love Adrian Newton until death do them part. Houston had seen family annihilations before, but this case carried a chilling intimacy that unsettled even veteran homicide detectives. Adrian Newton had worked construction, dreaming of building a better life for his young family. Alton was starting 2nd grade, his backpack still hanging by the front door. Little Farah had just learned to say mama and dada, words that would never leave her lips again. Frances Newton maintained her innocence from the moment of her arrest. A drug dealer, she insisted, had targeted her family over Adrian's debts. But prosecutors saw something far more sinister: a calculated killer who had orchestrated the perfect family murder. The evidence seemed overwhelming. A .25 caliber pistol, the murder weapon, had vanished without a trace. Frances had purchased $100,000 in life insurance policies on her husband and children just months before their deaths. Gunshot residue tests on her hands came back positive. But something didn't fit. Something that would shake the very foundation of Texas justice. The victim's own family members started questioning the case against Frances. Tom and Virginia Lewis, Adrian's parents, watched their daughter-in-law sit in that courthouse dock and felt something prosecutors couldn't explain. Doubt. In capital punishment cases, family members typically demand the harshest penalty possible. They want blood for blood. Justice served cold and final. Not this time. Not in this case. As Frances Newton's trial approached, an unprecedented drama was about to unfold, one that would pit the state's case against the very people who had lost everything that horrible April night. When victims' families defend the accused killer, something has gone terribly wrong with the pursuit of justice. 6 months before the murders, Frances Newton walked into a State Farm insurance office with a simple request. She wanted to protect her family. The agent processed 3 life insurance policies totaling $100,000. Adrian Newton, $50,000. 7-year-old Alton, $25,000. Baby Farah, $25,000. Premium payments, $30 monthly. The paperwork was routine. The timing would later prove devastating. Frances and Adrian's marriage had been deteriorating for months. High school sweethearts who married young, they now lived as strangers under the same roof. Adrian worked construction when jobs were available. Frances held down employment at a chemical plant, her hands often stained with industrial residue from 12-hour shifts. Money was always tight. Arguments were frequent. By early 1987, the couple had separated. Adrian moved out of their apartment, leaving Frances alone with the children. But separation didn't mean freedom, it meant financial desperation for a young mother trying to make ends meet on a single income. Then came the threats. According to Frances, Adrian had gotten involved with dangerous people. Drug dealers. Men who didn't forgive debts or accept excuses. She claimed Adrian owed money to street-level dealers who had made it clear that payment was not optional. They said they would hurt my family, Frances would later tell investigators. Adrian was in deep with some bad people, but prosecutors saw something entirely different in those insurance policies. To them, Frances Newton wasn't a protective mother, she was a calculating killer who had spent months planning the perfect crime. District Attorney Johnny Holmes would argue that the insurance policies represented cold-blooded premeditation. A woman who valued her family members' lives at exactly $100,000. The timing couldn't be ignored. Policies purchased in late 1986, murders committed in April 1987. Frances had always been described by neighbors and co-workers as quiet, responsible, devoted to her children. She attended church regularly. She worked steady jobs. She had no criminal record. Nothing in her background suggested violence or murder. Yet something had changed in those final months before the killings. Adrian's family noticed the tension during holiday gatherings. Frances seemed distant, stressed, constantly worried about money. Adrian appeared agitated, looking over his shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds. The couple's relationship had become a powder keg of financial pressure and unspoken threats. The drug dealer story would become central to Frances's defense. She insisted that Adrian's involvement with street dealers had put their entire family at risk. The insurance policies, she claimed, were purchased because she genuinely feared for their safety. But investigators found no evidence of drug dealer threats. No witnesses came forward. No names were provided. Adrian's autopsy showed no evidence of drug use. When love turns to suspicion and protection becomes premeditation, the line between victim and perpetrator becomes dangerously thin. As April 1987 approached, the Newton family was heading toward a collision that would end in gunshots, blood, and a courtroom battle over truth itself. The only question remaining was whether Frances Newton was trying to save her family or systematically planning to destroy it. April 7, 1987. 6:30 p.m. Frances Newton kissed her children goodbye and walked out of apartment 18. She needed groceries, she later told police. A routine evening trip to the store. Adrian was home with Alton and baby Farah. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. But Frances Newton's timeline that night would become the foundation of a murder case. According to her statement, she drove to Fiesta Mart, purchased groceries, then stopped at her cousin Sandra Nelm's house on Yellowstone Boulevard. The visit lasted approximately 2 hours. They talked. They watched television. Nothing unusual occurred. At 11:56 p.m., Frances returned home to find her front door unlocked. She stepped inside and discovered a scene that would haunt Houston homicide detectives for decades. Adrian sprawled across the living room couch, a single bullet wound in his chest. The children motionless in their beds, each killed by one precise gunshot. Frances called 911 immediately. Her voice, captured on dispatch recordings, trembled with what sounded like genuine shock and grief. But investigators noticed troubling inconsistencies in her account. Why had she spent 2 hours at her cousin's house during a simple grocery run? Why hadn't she called Adrian to check on the children? Most importantly, why were there no signs of forced entry or struggle at the crime scene? The apartment appeared undisturbed except for the bodies. No ransacked rooms. No missing valuables. No evidence that strangers had invaded the Newton home. Detective Ron Ellis processed the scene with methodical precision. 3 shell casings from a .25 caliber pistol. No fingerprints on the weapon itself because the murder weapon had vanished completely. When killers execute entire families and leave no trace of their presence, 2 possibilities emerge. Either they were professionals who knew exactly what they were doing, or the killer was someone the victims trusted enough to let inside. Frances Newton's evening grocery trip had somehow transformed into the deadliest night in her family's history. The question that would consume investigators was whether she was the last person to see her family alive or the first person to see them dead. Detective Ron Ellis had seen enough family murders to recognize the patterns. 90% of domestic homicides are committed by someone the victims know and trust. Within hours of discovering the bodies, Houston police had zeroed in on their prime suspect, Frances Newton herself. The evidence, they believed, painted a clear picture of premeditated murder disguised as random violence. The insurance policies topped their list of motives. $100,000 in coverage purchased just months before the killings. To investigators, this wasn't coincidence, it was calculation. Frances's behavior after the murders also raised red flags. Detectives noted her composed demeanor during questioning. She answered questions methodically. She didn't break down. She didn't scream or demand vengeance against her family's killers. But the most damning evidence came from forensic testing. Gunshot residue tests on Frances's hands returned positive results. The microscopic particles of barium and antimony, telltale signs of recent firearm discharge, were found on both her palms and fingers. Frances's defense attorney would later argue that the residue came from her job at the Hercules chemical plant, where she handled industrial materials containing similar compounds. But prosecutors dismissed this explanation as desperate deflection. The missing murder weapon became central to the case. A .25 caliber pistol had fired the 3 fatal shots, yet police never recovered the gun. Investigators theorized that Frances had disposed of the weapon during her 2-hour window between the murders and calling 911. Search warrants were executed at multiple locations. Police dogs scoured nearby drainage ditches and dumpsters. The weapon remained elusive. On April 27, 1987, exactly 3 weeks after the murders, Frances Newton was arrested and charged with capital murder. When evidence points in one direction and the suspect maintains innocence, the question becomes whether investigators are following facts or constructing a narrative. The arrest marked the beginning of a legal battle that would consume the next 18 years of Frances Newton's life, culminating in a death chamber where the final truth would die with her. October 1988. Harris County Courthouse. The case of the state of Texas versus Frances Elaine Newton would determine whether a mother lived or died. Prosecutor Lynn McClellan stood before 12 jurors with a simple narrative: greed disguised as grief. She methodically presented the state's case, piece by devastating piece. The $100,000 insurance policies. The positive gunshot residue tests. The missing murder weapon. The suspicious timeline. Frances Newton didn't just kill her family, McClellan told the jury. She executed them for money. The prosecution's star witnesses painted Frances as a calculating killer who had spent months planning the perfect crime. Insurance agent testimony revealed that Frances had specifically requested the maximum coverage available. Forensic experts explained how gunshot residue particles could only come from recent firearm discharge. Most damaging was the timeline evidence. Prosecutors argued that Frances had killed her family before 7 p.m., disposed of the murder weapon, then created an alibi by visiting her cousin. The 2-hour gap, they claimed, was Frances's window for covering up triple murder. Defense attorney Charles Ogletree faced an uphill battle against circumstantial evidence that seemed ironclad. His strategy focused on reasonable doubt and alternative theories. The missing murder weapon, he argued, proved nothing. Drug dealers could have easily disposed of the gun. The gunshot residue could have come from Frances's chemical plant job, where she handled industrial compounds daily. Ogletree brought witnesses who testified about Adrian's alleged drug connections. He highlighted the lack of physical evidence linking Frances directly to the murders. No fingerprints on shell casings. No blood spatter on her clothing. No witnesses placing her at the scene during the killings. The state wants you to convict Frances Newton based on suspicion and speculation, Ogletree told jurors. But suspicion is not evidence, and speculation is not proof. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Emotions ran high as crime scene photographs were displayed and 911 recordings played. Frances maintained her composure throughout, rarely showing emotion as prosecutors described her as a cold-blooded killer. On October 18, 1988, the jury began deliberations. 4 hours later, they returned with their verdict: guilty of capital murder. When 12 strangers decide your fate in less time than it takes to watch a movie, the American justice system shows its most terrifying efficiency. The sentencing phase began immediately. Prosecutors argued that Frances represented a continuing threat to society and deserved the ultimate punishment. The defense pleaded for life imprisonment, emphasizing Frances's lack of prior criminal history and her role as a mother. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before recommending death. Frances Newton was sentenced to die by lethal injection, becoming one of the few women on Texas death row. But her legal battle was just beginning. 17 years after the murders, Tom and Virginia Lewis made a decision that would shock the Texas legal system. The grieving grandparents of Alton and Farrah Newton, the children allegedly murdered by Frances, stepped forward with an unprecedented declaration. They opposed her execution. "We never wanted to see Frances get executed," Virginia Lewis wrote in a sworn affidavit. "Nobody from the DA's office ever asked our opinion about what we wanted to happen to Frances. In capital murder cases, victims' families typically demand blood for blood. They attend court hearings. They give victim impact statements. They watch from the gallery as justice is served with lethal injection. Not the Lewis family. Not in this case." Tom and Virginia Lewis had spent nearly 2 decades wrestling with doubt. They had watched Frances's appeals wind through the court system. They had seen the evidence presented and represented. They had asked themselves the same question that would haunt any grandparent. Could the mother of their grandchildren really be their killer? Their answer defied everything prosecutors expected from victims' families. Virginia Lewis became Frances's most unlikely advocate, writing letters to the governor and appearing at clemency hearings. She testified that she believed Frances was innocent. She begged officials to spare the life of the woman convicted of murdering her son and grandchildren. "All my prayers and hopes are that she won't get executed," Virginia Lewis stated publicly. "I just don't think she did it." The family's position created an unprecedented moral dilemma for Texas prosecutors. How do you execute someone when the victim's own parents are pleading for mercy? How do you claim justice is being served when those who suffered the greatest loss believe the wrong person is on death row? District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal dismissed the family's concerns, arguing that evidence not emotion determines guilt or innocence. The state had proven its case beyond reasonable doubt, he maintained. The jury had spoken. Justice demanded Frances Newton's execution. But the Lewis family's opposition raised uncomfortable questions about the prosecution's handling of the case. When the people who lost everything are fighting to save the person accused of taking it all away, something fundamental has broken in the pursuit of justice. Tom and Virginia Lewis had buried their son and grandchildren in 1987. Now they were fighting to prevent another death, the execution of Frances Newton. They believed that killing Frances wouldn't bring back Adrian, Alton, or Farah. It would only add another tragedy to an already devastating case. Their voices would echo through Frances's final appeals, creating a moral complexity that death penalty cases rarely face. Victims' families defending the condemned. September 14, 2005. 6:12 p.m. Frances Elaine Newton walked into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit 18 years after the murders that brought her there. Her last meal request was simple: 1 piece of fried chicken, 1 piece of fish, French fries, 2 dinner rolls, and a strawberry cake. She ate quietly in her cell, refusing interviews with reporters who had gathered to witness Texas history in the making. At 6:12 p.m., Frances was strapped to the gurney. The warden asked if she had any final words. "I am innocent," Frances said, her voice steady and clear. "The people who did this are still out there. My son, my husband, and my daughter. I love y'all. Tell my family I love them. Continue to pray for me. I'm going home to be with God." 3 minutes later, at 6:15 p.m., Frances Newton was pronounced dead. She became the first black woman executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982. She was the third woman executed in Texas since that time. Her death marked the end of an 18-year legal battle that had divided families, raised questions about evidence, and challenged the very foundations of capital punishment. But Frances Newton's execution didn't end the controversy, it intensified it. The victim's family members who had fought to save her life watched from the witness gallery, their faces etched with grief and doubt. Virginia Lewis, who had spent years advocating for Frances's innocence, left the prison that night believing Texas had executed the wrong person. Questions that prosecutors claimed were settled by the 1988 conviction remained unanswered. Where was the murder weapon? Why had no drug dealers ever been identified or investigated? How could a mother with no history of violence systematically execute her own children? The case files remain sealed in Harris County archives, holding evidence that may never see daylight again. When the state executes someone despite the victim's family's pleading for mercy, it reveals the cold machinery of capital punishment stripped of its moral justifications. Frances Newton's case forces uncomfortable questions about certainty, justice, and the irreversible nature of the death penalty. In a system where appellate courts overturn convictions years after execution, her story serves as a stark reminder that dead defendants tell no tales and offer no new evidence. The truth about what happened on April 7, 1987, died with Frances Newton in that Huntsville death chamber. Was justice served that September evening? Or did Texas execute an innocent mother whose only crime was being in the wrong place when tragedy struck her family? You decide. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe for more true crime cases that challenge everything you think you know about guilt, innocence, and the pursuit of justice.